All right, well, if you turn the TV on, open a newspaper, whatever you do to get your information, it's really hard not to see anything about JFK. It's the 50th anniversary that's coming up, and it's brought up that whole idea of a generation defined by that question, where were you when? And that is the anniversary that everyone seems to remember from that generation, is where were you when JFK was assassinated? Tons of movies been made with him. He's done lots of cameos, as not himself, of course, but in things like The Watchmen. Somebody who just won't leave people's memories. And even, well, I wasn't around at the time, but I know who he was. I know the story behind him. And do you...
Well, it was interesting because we were in Dallas 2 years ago, and we actually went to the site. They have the historical site where JFK, they have exactly where the motorcade was. They have the room where Lee Harvey Oswald was, the book depository. So it's kind of creepy and very eerie in the sense that you're walking in history. But they do say that the Kennedys were royalty, or are royalty. I mean, everybody followed the Kennedys. When JFK came into power, it was a romantic era. He was the youngest president. He was very good looking, married a beautiful wife. They had, the picture-perfect family, but he also, had affairs. And of course, the whole Marilyn Monroe thing, made him Hollywoodized. And then for him to be assassinated in like a big public moment with, at the time, thousands. Today it would be millions across the world watching, but to be riding in a motorcade, sitting on top of a convertible, no cover, just, 2 rows maybe of Secret Service walking with his wife beside him, that would never, ever be done again. Like, nobody of political, popularity would do that, but
It's interesting because you bring up a lot of really particular features of that incident that make it memorable. It's not just about that moment, not just about even, how terrible the end came, but all the things that led up to it. And so for us, what is the defining question of this generation? Where were you when?
I remember 9/11 obviously is a big one.
Right.
Definitely for everybody on this panel, but I was in creative communications at the time, and I remember I had picked up my carpool guest, I guess, and we were driving to college that day, and it was on the radio, like it came on the radio. But at the time, I was at the Notre Dame campus, which is also right next to the airport. So for me, I remember when that was announced, because I remember that day everybody in class was just super stressed out because nobody knew what was going on.
And they were talking about other locations that were targets, and I remember that being one of the concerns, is that there were a couple of Canadian cities on the map.
And they were diverting a bunch of air traffic to places like Winnipeg. So all we were doing was sitting in this box basically at college, and we can hear all these planes flying overhead after we hear about these 2 planes crashing into the Twin Towers and the Pentagon. And I'm sitting there going, holy, what's happening? It felt like the world was ending. There was actually, it was just, everybody was just really confused, and a lot of people were like, I don't want to be here. It was, because you can imagine, all these planes coming in from different places, Denver, all these, it was just wild. I'll never forget that.
It's almost, as much as it didn't happen in Canada, it's kind of Canada's Pearl Harbor.
Yeah.
And we had never experienced something so close to home. I think that's a huge part of why we all remember that, is we've never felt military threat to ourselves. And when we heard, and then after that, there's the Al-Qaeda threat that seems to have lingered, but there was that moment where we could get hit right now, and we've never had to experience that.
Right? That we are all sitting ducks, and that there's a higher power out there. Day last year, Gorbachev came, and he was interviewed by Craig Kielburger, and one of the questions Craig said to him, how did it feel? You had X amount of nuclear missiles aimed at all over the world, and you held the finger on the button. And it was hard to believe because most of the kids in the audience had no clue and probably really couldn't fathom that power that you have. Even if something startled you or whatever, and you pressed it, it was just
you dropped your coffee.
You dropped your coffee. I don't know. But really to have that single power to do that,
and it was something that it's a moment in time that describes an era as well. And I remember it was my first day when 9/11 happened. It was the first day of my internship at TVO in Toronto, downtown Toronto, a live television show, my first day, and I get there and I walk in and there's monitors everywhere. And of course everyone's, notepads are dropped, everyone's standing there in shock, and I watched as the second plane hit. And it was just like, what is happening? Like, is this real? And then the day went on as the crazy jumble, but was fascinating.
I know. Talking about it.
Yeah, it was just a shock. Walking home through, I live downtown, every store was open, everyone was leaning out talking, every monitor had images, like everyone just completely bound together.
Yeah, that's...
And it makes you remember that moment where everyone was just like, there was nothing else anyone was talking about,
Yeah, in a strange way, it brought people together.
Yeah.
They actually have a term for it. It's called flashbulb memory. And they elicit, I think they say that people can remember every detail because it elicits such strong emotional response. But what I find interesting is that you can't always predict like what you're gonna be emotional about. Like Princess Diana, her death was another one for me, and I was really young and I didn't even know who she was, but I remember that moment for whatever reason. I remember my mom waking me up and saying, Princess Diana was killed last night, and I had no idea who she was, but I remember that moment because it just like elicits a certain response from you, I think.
And it's symbolic. She stood for this princess who came from, really nowhere, and she had a tough time fitting in with the royal family, and she had all this great charity work and this difficult relationship that she fought through, and
and finally divorced, so it made her real. And then getting her life back together again, and kind of the romance again kindling, and then to be killed in such, again, a tragic thing, and so suddenly. And I think, again, when you say you feel so strongly, it's because a lot of these things happen and people are killed either needlessly or way too young. And we only can kind of guess on what kind of greatness they could have done. And that's the empty feeling. That's the one where it goes, oh.
And then there's like things like Dimebag Darrell from Pantera, guitar player for Pantera, when he was shot like in the face on stage, like mid set. I'll never forget when I knew exactly where we were. Still to this day, me and all my buddies get together. We have black-toothed grins to celebrate his legacy, and like he was a great guy, and everybody loved him in the metal world. Like he was just really looked up to, and then when Kurt Cobain shot himself, that's up for debate too. Some people say Courtney Love had something to do with it, but that's another thing altogether. We won't go there, but I
think her group whole just drove him to.
Yeah, might have. He's like, I wrote all that too. Oh man. But anyway, like I think for everybody else, everybody's got something, and it might even be just a childhood memory that flashes in your brain that you'll never forget. It could.
It's interesting when it becomes universal.
Yeah.
Right? Like I think we all sort of have things that, because we have our interests, our passions, but when there's something that's universal that actually makes us remember an incident, right?
And everybody remembers that.
Yeah, regardless of your political stripes or your background. It's
How about Miley Cyrus twerking on Robin Thicke?
I'm going to forget that.
But do you think we'll remember things like that though too?
I was going to ask you guys if you had any embarrassing or moments you don't want to admit to, because personally I remember every detail of when Jerry Halliwell left the Spice Girls.
See, that's what
I remember every detail, and I don't know why, and I don't know why that memory sticks out, but I remember an emotional response.
That's a good point, because Spice Girls were so huge. They were such a big deal. Right? Now it's like it's not on anyone's radar, except for yours.
Amazing. Well, for me, other than the 9/11, the only other thing that sticks up with me is when Jack Layton died, and I remember exactly where I was and where I heard it. And actually, perhaps more specifically, I also remember when he gave his initial speech, and you could hear it in his voice. I was in my car listening to the radio, and I heard it in his voice when he was saying that he was going to step down for a little while, and I thought, that doesn't even sound like Jack Layton. And I'll never forget that moment, being in the car being like, oh, I thought something really cool is going to happen in Canadian politics. But we're going to take another quick break, and it seems like a good time to just take a minute to think about some important things. But yeah.